Welcome to the Realm of Ideas is Free to All. This is episode 59, Copying and Plagiarism Part 2, Applications. Okay, a series of ruminations that are done once a week. There's a preview on Wednesday evening, and then we basically going to do our program here at 2 o'clock on Sunday morning in the heart of New York City. So today's topic is a continuation of a topic that we started talking about in that last week. The first one was basically a kind of follow-up to a piece that we had done a while ago about the difference between a draftsman or an artist and a copyist. But this basically took on copying and plagiarism and kind of used plagiarism in an artificial sense to kind of like play off the idea of copying in a kind of like natural sense, which is really the kind of way in which it's developed. And the applications are things that possibly could be roots or kind of like potential positions towards an organic architecture. Anyway, so we had started the part one with an homage to JFK from Borges. And then yesterday and this week, we kind of like follow up with Borges from which I find a really fascinating piece. It was like Pierre Menard, author of The Quixote. And the interesting piece is, if you haven't known this piece by Borges, it's really kind of as if an individual who is of a different time, who is a contemporary, right, of Borges, is to not try to write The Quixote, but to basically, like a contemporary version of Quixote, but to write the Quixote as if it was an original work of his own. So, two texts of distinctly unequal value inspired the understanding, one that was philological fragment by Novalis, number 2025 of Dresden edition to be precise, which outlined the notion of total identification with a given author. The other was one of those parasitic books that set Christ on a boulevard, Hamlet on a, don't know whichever that, what is that word, Camembert, or Don Quixote on Wall Street. Like every man of taste, Menard abominated these pointless travesties. And if anybody looks at modern theater, they understand the same thing, or modern opera. A plebeian delight of anachronism, or worse yet, captivating us with the elementary notion that all times and places are the same or are different. It might be more interesting, he thought, though, of contradictory and superficial execution to attempt what Daudet had so famously suggested, conjoin in a single figure both the ingenious gentleman Don Quixote and his squire. Those who have insinuated that Menard devoted his life to writing a contemporary Quixote besmirched his illustrious memory. Menard did not want to compose another Quixote, which surely is easy enough. He wanted to compose the Quixote. Nor surely need one be obliged to note that his goal was never a mechanical transcription of the original. He had no intention of copying it. His admirable ambition was to produce a number of pages which coincided word for word and line for line with those of Miguel de Cervantes. My purpose is merely astonishing, he wrote me in September 30th, 1934, from Bayonne. The final term of a teleological or metaphysical proof. The world around us, or God, or chance, or universal forms, is no more final, no more uncommon than my revealed novel. The sole difference is that philosophers publish pleasant volumes containing the intermediate stages of their work, while I am resolved to suppress those stages of my own, and indeed there is not a single draft to bear witness to that years-long labor. Okay, I remember reading this piece and understanding the idea of a fact that Heraclitus says, you can never step into the same river twice. So even in the case where something is produced identically in terms of form, it doesn't exist in context. And that is such a beautiful idea. I remember a similar situation for me when I was folding, and in case understanding as an architect, I was dealing with the idea of kind of, I had found origami as a craft, but then I realized that within origami as a kind of a fun hobby, there are a series of kind of people who kind of do serious kind of what they would call folding, which is not making little squirrels and owls and things like that, but actually kind of making things of particular consequence in terms of the idea of kind of a folded piece, a plate. Now, there are different kinds of pieces, but I realized in my case, what I was interested was what's called corrugations and tessellations. Corrugators and tessellations have certain rules, and as a result, my interest was that I was going to do these things. Now, again, I had seen and was aware to a degree of certain people who I had met who had folded long tessellations, but at the same time, basically what I'd seen, there was a manuscript by someone who's actually a kind of distant friend of mine, a colleague, whatever, and he had done a series of these tessellations, and I thought to myself, they seem to be somewhat lacking in a certain symmetry. So I thought to myself, could I manifest these things in a symmetrical fashion? So what I did was I wanted to kind of take a kind of added symmetry that I hadn't seen, not that it hadn't existed, but simply that I had not seen. So in the case, I looked upon it as my intention to create this circumstance, not aware that the possibility existed, but not sure if the individual pieces existed. So as a result, when I would kind of complete a piece, I came to the point where I said, I don't know if this exists, but I know that I've found it. And the thing is, it was not an ignorance of the pieces itself. It was the fact that I had understood without kind of basically tracing someone else's steps. I had found my steps to get to what might have been someone else's final destination or was my own original destination. So that's why kind of later on, I kind of came to see that piece as something that was really brilliant. Because the thing is, if tonight I was looking at Dali's crucifixion, and many people have painted the crucifixion, but for me, Dali's crucifixion, it's next to at the Met, it's next to Velázquez's kind of the dinner of after Christ has, I don't remember the title, but it's the Velázquez painting where there are kind of three people sitting, and it's like the dinner after he's risen. And you see these two brilliant pieces sitting there. And then in the distance, I see this, a painting by Van Dyck, and I realize what an incredibly fortunate circumstance. But anyway, the point of this is that crucifixion has a circumstance that basically appreciates this understanding. I think that's something that in an artificial sense anyway, we see as that which comes from personal investigation. So that one may come to the final conclusion, even mimic the same piece, right? And I think also about like Leibniz and Newton coming to the calculus at the same time, but doing it independently and doing different parts of it, and actually kind of like having an original understanding of two individuals towards that same thing. Anyway, that's a labored beginning to what is, I think, one of our best particular episodes. And with no further ado, we get to the most important piece of the show, or whatever this little spectacle is, which is what's new in Julie. So, what is new in Julie?
Well, I didn't quite have the drawing time I was hoping, but I worked on my drawing, which I hopefully will be able to finish next week. The drawing has a title now. Mm-hmm.
Is it T's Tea?
Mm-hmm. Yes, that's what I'm calling.
That's the title? That's a good title.
Yeah. I didn't have the energy to think of a better title. Well, it'll be called, actually, Architect of the Compound Eye. That is the title.
I like that.
Mm-hmm.
You going to show us?
Sure. Is it somewhere?
It's right there.
Okay, I'll go get it. Ow. Ow.
Oh, sorry, P.
Really hurt.
Sorry, P.
Ow. Ow. So here's my drawing.
And you erased this piece in the lower corner and left the ghost in this area here. And now, let's see. Yeah, you can still see the impression of it, but I don't think that, like we said, that piece was not really developing. But I do think that there's a potential, given the layered capability, the layered capacity of this brilliant drawing, to kind of find that piece, to find its kind of like maybe apparitional quality. I look at this, it almost seems as if something I'm looking at under a microscope of an imaginary world, but at the same time, it has this highly mechanistic kind of like you said. I mean, the MOF was something that you were kind of looking at as kind of like a hybrid system, and here I think you've done a brilliant job at that.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, so that's what's left, correct?
So right. Mm-hmm. So what I'll do is find something meaningful that makes sense to put in the space. What I took out was an important piece of information, but I don't think compositionally it worked as well, because I made a number of key changes, one of which is the Indian piece that I drew in up here as the metaphor for what happens in the compound eye, which, those of you unfamiliar, the compound eye is the eye that insects have, arthropods have, some crustaceans have, not a human eye in any way, shape, or form. Our eye has very singular parts of it, not multiple units that all work together. The key thing about the compound eye is these ocular units, in this case over 750 of them in many insect eyes, as I understand from my own research, over 1,000, over 1,500, depending on the species of ocular units. And what my drawing is actually about is the process, is the actual engineering and the actual architecture that crafts or creates the compound eye, which was not really well known prior to this. It turns out, for those of you who are not unable to join us last week, I'll give you a recap in a sentence. It's calcium waves that actually are the architect, and I would as much call these calcium waves the engineer of the compound eye too. And what is key is they come in not in the early phases of ocular development, which is very, 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 how should I say, surprising, because one would think that they would be involved, but they are not. They actually come in the middle phase and the end phase as almost a sculptor or a polisher. Their function, which is rather astonishing, is in fact to make sure that these hexagonal ocular units, which must maintain a perfect hexagonal shape in order to function properly, are all perfect geometric hexagons, which is rather amazing because they are not self-similar geometric hexagons. So meaning they are not all the same size over the convex dome, over the entire square area of the compound eye. It turns out they are quite different sizes. Some are rather large in comparison to those on the periphery of the compound eye. So they have slightly different functions based on their position on the curvature of the dome of the compound eye, which I've shown in my drawing. As you can see, certain parts of my drawing show the fluctuation in size, and they have to work around the bristling hairs that are part of the eye, the other apparatuses, the other structures. It doesn't work in isolation. So I used an Indian container, which is in the Indian wings, still on view at the Met. I believe it's part of their permanent collection. And why I chose this piece is it uses very faceted inlaid metals, silver, brass, and gold, in an ebony base, but the base is really a substrate rather than just a base. The base hardly gets a chance to peek through, much like the ommatidia in the eye is what we see when we look and examine the compound eye. We don't really see what's underneath. We don't see any of the tendons or the ligaments or the muscles or really any of the structures that move and operate the eye, much like this, quite small box. And the box actually holds things used for visual and auditory. They don't really know, but it seems like a ritual box. So that's its purpose.
Okay. All right.
Yeah.
So let's continue on with where we left off last week. Like I said, I think that one of the things that I want to look at is the fact that as we've kind of taken it from the artificial realm of draftsman artist versus kind of copyist, and then put it in the case where now we're comparing the copyist to the plagiarist hasn't really become something of very much consequence here, except to basically give us an aspect to see the difference between the reality and the circumstance and consequence of original work and that of an individual who's a fraud. So no need to kind of get into the kind of like, malevolent and kind of like narcissistic reality of a plagiarist, but just to kind of see here the idea, the fact that the copyist in a natural sense, in the kind of like sense of nature, has a consequence that we need to contend with. So in the case of what I was saying, in terms of an organic architecture, I think there's potentials here, but I think the piece that may not be obvious is that it's not in terms of habitations, but it's in terms of activities. Now, again, architects have this predilection where we are individuals who inhabit certain things. We go to church, we basically watch a football game, that these activities are not the primary. It's the way in which we kind of stand around or kind of exactly have an artifact or a kind of an edifice that's erected. The point of organic architecture, I believe, is the process and the activity, not the thing itself. It's the actual motion. So based on that, we'll continue with this discussion of applications.
Yeah, please continue.
That's it. So you're going to continue with the things you had talked about. You have your notes. So I was like,
sure, of course. Okay, I'll start with my original notes for my original ideas here. So I will start with unexpected copies. So the idea of a false doppelganger or presumed template. So when an entity, a process, a pattern, or function appears to be a copy of a similar or familiar specimen, object, artifact, or in fact environment, but is in fact quite measurably or quantifiably different from that presumed template. Now, this is something very, very unexpected. When people see two animals or two plants or two specimens, two crustaceans, two arthropods, and they appear extremely similar, they don't look any further. I mean, a person, even a lot of scientists, would not assume that these two very, very similar, and in many cases, they really look practically identical, living creatures are in fact wholly different from each other. So a really premium example, and I just finished reading, well, I'm almost finished reading the research article in the journal Science, and this was published 27 November 2025 issue of Science. I urge you all to read it. It's a fascinating article on ancient DNA and the domestication of cats, and it's not at all what people think. So it turns out that in archaeological digs, these two very, very different types of animal species are virtually indistinguishable. And that's rather fascinating. So, in archaeological digs, even the experts cannot distinguish between what is called a semi domesticated cat, because it turns out there's no such thing as a domesticated cat. They cannot ever be fully domesticated. They easily, readily, and immediately will revert to a feral state. So the cat, as a pet, as a companion, is all smoke and mirrors. It's there very, very temporarily, and it really has not altered from its wild state. Not like a dog, which are greatly, greatly altered from their wolf ancestry, psychologically and physically and morphologically. Cats, not at all. So they're skeletal, fossilized, or mummified specimens or remains, when they are found, are indistinguishable from a pet cat and a lot of wild cat species. And here's a bit of science humor. We could certainly use some science humor. It's always a good time for science humor. In fact, I miss the Far Side every day. So, one particular very famous wildcat species is Felis sylvestris, which I would speculate is where Felix the cat came from. You change a single letter to an X, and Felis is Felix, Felix. And Sylvestris is Sylvester, the very famous Looney Tunes cat. I mean, Chuck Jones and Fleischer were very intelligent guys, and I'm sure knew that wildcat uses these two Latin words. So the point is, the only three changes between these two unexpected copies cannot be seen or perceived. The domestic cat has much longer intestines than the wild cat, which is actually fascinating because in many cases, the why is more interesting than the result. This is one of them. It sounds like a small thing, but it is not. The house cat lives on human scraps, human food, and human versions of what cats eat. They eat human food, they eat plants, they eat fruit, they eat vegetables.
All
Rather,
fish.
yeah, that's true.
Mhm.
Very, very.
Nerd girls.
No one wants to eat a nerd girl. They
Well,
taste
once they pass
terrible.
away,
Oh yeah,
they're left
true.
there.
Yeah. Rather than the feral or wild cats that are carnivores strictly. They never touch plants. They never eat plants. They will not go for fruits or vegetables. They will literally go for meat. So they have much shorter intestines because it turns out, oh, yes, carbs. One of the main reasons is the feral cats don't eat carbohydrates of any kind. The house cat has learned to love its cupcakes, its pasta, its rice, all human food, its cake, its bread, its cookies. So carbohydrates take much longer and have longer transit time.
So it's like anything you would give a boyfriend if you had one and you didn't have to substitute with a cat.
Well, if you wanted a boyfriend, yeah,
Right. But I'm
you
saying
would
like,
stretch
go
out your own
exactly.
intestines
So the thing is
and
like
hang yourself.
if you don't have a boyfriend and you use a cat as a substitute,
Yeah,
it would eat all the things you would give to a boyfriend if you had one.
yeah, I would
Okay.
say.
All right.
And not surprisingly, the size of the brain is significantly smaller in the house cat than the feral cat.
Look at its competitors, right?
Yeah.
It's like women with drama degrees from Vassar and
Mhm.
Mount Holyoke and things like that. So
Not
it's
a
like
lot of
there's
competition
not a lot of
intellectually,
competition.
not a lot
Exactly.
of problem
They're not
solving.
really they're not really being taxed to the same degree.
Right. So a feral cat has to problem solve all the time.
Mm-hmm.
And here's one
How
that
to
will,
get to the Cheerios.
yeah, true.
Mm-hmm. How to open the cabinets.
I'm more of a Rice Krispies gal, but
Mm-hmm.
anyway, the third difference in these unexpected copies, these are the hidden things that you would never see from simply morphological observation of the house cat and the feral cat, are behavioral changes. So, believe it or not, they're more social and friendly, as standoffish as a house cat is. They're still far more social and friendly than a wild cat. And the wild cat's centers of the brain that control fear and aggression are significantly larger because that's what they operate on.
Well, because they don't dominate their environment to the degree that house cats do.
Yeah, I suppose. And the final thing about this article about these unexpected copies, these presumed templates, is we have thrown back by 4,000 years the date for the domestication of the feral cat. People thought it was 6,000 years ago in ancient Egypt. Then it was pushed back 2,000 years prior to that in Israel, interestingly. And then another 2,000 years prior to that in Cyprus. So they have now definitively tracked the origins of unexpected copies. When did these two copies of each other really part ways? Well, we have the answer, and I'm happy to share this answer. It's really, really a staggering and stunning piece of Arthur Conan Doyle style, Holmesian detective work. 10,000 years is the answer. They thought it was 6. That's quite a leap. Anyway, on to you.
Okay, so
That's
I think
page 1 of my notes.
good. So one of the things that was interesting, our number one fan, Mr. Spock, had asked me if I had thought about mirror neurons as kind of have an aspect in copying. So I basically thought to myself, I'm not really kind of up on the subject, but let me look into that. And I kind of realized that what at least my understanding of a mirror neuron is the fact that in terms of the activity or recognition of the activity, the brain function is similar. Now, which means you have a recognition of something that you yourself have built. And it kind of seems very similar to what I'm talking about in terms of folding, in the fact that I had come, and the piece by Borges, in the fact that Minar basically duplicates, not because of a lack of understanding of the Quixote, but understanding the Quixote historically, culturally within himself, and then realizing that it's an aspiration of originality. And so in this case, I'd say it's a similar circumstance in the fact that I had a activity that I set about with certain parameters. And regardless of how I created the conclusion, though Cervantes obviously came to his conclusion at a different time, a different place. And as Heraclitus says, you don't speak, step twice in the same river. Though the result is the same, the context is not. So I think in this case, the mirror neuron will see a different, though it recognizes it, it has to recognize it, I'm assuming, based on the way in which you've constructed that thing for yourself. So if you recognize this in something else, you have to have some kind of way in which you've cobbled this thing together. Now, the way in which the other person activates this may have a final result that's similar, but the process by which they created it could in fact be different. And those differences may be a part of that circumstance. But that's a cursory kind of like quick look at what that could have been. But for me, that's my first take on it, but it was a great question. So thank you very much for that. So.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I'll move on to page 3 and go back to page 2 because I want to leave you plenty of time to wrap it up at the end and say whatever else you would like to say, because this is more important than my notes of page 2. A key concept that most people are very unaware of is convergent evolution. And this is incredibly important, especially as this appears in plants. Convergent evolution means, for those of you who are unfamiliar, is when totally different species are headed to the same place and arrive there in different ways from completely different paths. They're not genetic copies. They are often unrelated to each other. They can be in the same genus or species. They don't have to be. So this is quite an ingenious form of copying. So it's basically that different species in the same genus or others copy each other quite intentionally in order to further their survival. They evolve ways to outwit predators, ways to attract mates, ways to get more food, ways to overcome drought or heat, or floods. I mean, these are incredible ways of survival. It is not a Darwinian idea, but it has many of the earmarks of a Darwinian idea. So I will give you a really great example. A couple in the genus of Solanum, or the nightshades, known by their common name, the eggplant and potato, have convergently evolved to have many of the same characteristics. How they grow and the root structure, the timing of their flowering. Many houseplants like Dracaenas and Sansevierius also are mimicking each other, but have gotten there in entirely different ways. In humans who were separated by thousands and thousands of miles, many traits had evolved over the years, but completely independently, because these groups of early hominids never met. But they had the same problems, and their genetics answered those problems. Would you like to?
Yes. I would say what we're seeing here is a series of analogs in the fact that we have different origins that come to the same function, and that the copy basically kind of anticipates these things in terms of the individual. So I think even in the case of what we see the fact that the different individuals goes back to mirror neurons, goes back to like the piece by Borges, is that we come from different origins, but we come, the final solution ends up being very similar. So the destination is arrived at. But I think the interesting thing for me is the way in which we kind of continue to come to these similar solutions. And that we can probably, this goes back to my viewing a million years ago of the mystery of Picasso, where Picasso basically kind of like shows you the process by which you get to the final conclusion. So in that case, I kind of see this kind of analogous circumstance that we've talked about. We've talked about the operation of the metaphor as an artificial thing that takes its origin from its origins in the national world, in the natural world. I'd say that in this case, the analog that we use in a literary sense is also something that exists originally in the natural world, in terms of the fact that analog and homolog are also talked about primarily in a scientific natural context.
Mm-hmm.
Hmm.
Okay, great. Very, very key points. Well stated.
I'm brilliant, by the way. I mean, but you knew that.
Yeah, sure. No one is contesting that.
We don't know that. No one said. They might say like, he's not brilliant.
I don't know. Anyway, I'd like to bring up one of the most ingenious copyists I have ever researched.
Oh, thank you.
You're welcome.
It was not me?
No, it's not
okay.
you. Okay. Sorry, unless you've morphed into a vine. Are you a vine?
At times.
Okay. Well, here's something you're all going to want to know about. It is flooring, fascinating, and sounds like something out of science fiction, but it's quite real.
As do I.
Yeah, you are something out of science fiction. I'll have the mothership come for you. So, what is amazing about this is the biological mimicry it is involved in. Now, this is a highly advanced version of Batesian mimicry that I discussed last week, named after the British explorer and scientist Bates, who sent back like 14,000 specimens after his first ship. Unfortunately, he was not on it, or he never would have been able to send back another 11 years worth of Amazonian specimens, including about 8,000 or 9,000 completely undiscovered species. But I digress. Let me get right to the chameleon vine. Now, the chameleon vine is a native of Chile. Its abilities at copying are singular in the plant world, singular in the animal world. I have never read a piece about anything else that has these abilities, except maybe Odo in Deep Space Nine, but that is a fictional character, maybe. So the actual vine native to Chile is Bocchia trifoliolata. What this vine can do is it copies not just the leaves of its host plants, it copies the shape, the venation, the color, the size, and can rapidly increase the size of its own leaves tenfold. I mean, it would be as if suddenly a human being could turn purple and turn plaid and grow to be, say, 100 feet tall. I mean, and this happens organically, aggressively, and not intergenerationally. It happens immediately. So this is like a fast forward version of epigenetic adaptation, which usually needs a generation or two to fully manifest. this does immediately. So what this plant does, and it doesn't mimic one host, it can mimic up to 20 hosts, probably more. And here's the kicker: at the same time. One vine on one tree, if there are other vines, it will mimic those. It doesn't need to physically touch the host plants. Why does it do this? Because it is delicious. It tastes great. Everyone wants to eat it. It's not venomous. It's not poisonous. It has not a defense in the world. It would be eaten up as everyone's favorite Caesar salad. And the only way is to mimic its host, blend in, and it chooses hosts that are toxic, that are not very appealing. It's for protection and structure because it has very little structure of its own. It's a flimsy, weak vine, but it is an ingenious, flimsy, weak vine. So the chameleon vine is the only known plant species which practices something called mimetic polymorphism. I'll say that again because it's a term you won't hear much and you won't hear as a description of any other plant, because no other plant that we know of has or possesses this remarkable ability: mimetic polymorphism. It's not a crypsis skill, which is a simplified version for those of you unfamiliar with crypsis first.
I don't know what crypsis means.
Crypsis means the ability to quickly mimic one species in one way and blend. Okay. This does far, far, far more than that.
Right.
Yeah. Okay. Aren't you?
Okay. So in that case, this piece has the ability to kind of put itself amongst other vines. So on one particular strand, I could see several different leaves that mimic those surrounding it.
Correct. Okay. In different ways at the same time.
Well, that's what I'm saying. Yeah, I mean, if it's next to an ivy, if it's next to a holly, if it's next to a different, you would get like 5 different vine. It's 5 different leaf shapes on the same vine. So it's like at one point there's basically a transition, and you would be able to kind of see all those things.
And it can mimic other species, meaning not just vines. It mimics a tree if it climbs a tree. If a flower grows, if moss grows, it can mimic moss.
Okay.
I mean, it's pretty amazing. Anything it comes in contact with that's plant-like, it will.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. So, I mean, how is this different? I mean, it's an extreme version of a kind of chameleon, correct?
Hence the really apt moniker, the chameleon vine, because as we know, or the cuttlefish vine, I would call it too, is rapid. The cuttlefish and a chameleon can in seconds change their texture, change their pattern, change their color, even their size. I mean, they can curl, like in the case of a cuttlefish, it can coil up its legs and create a nose when it doesn't have one. It can take 2 legs and create antennae. It can actually walk and create feet.
I think one of the things I started by talking about folding, and I talked about
that was very
surfaces.
Interesting.
And I think one of the things that always has vexed me in terms of like organic architecture is the fact that the ability to engineer these surfaces and manifolds is incredibly difficult given inorganic circumstance, because they just seem to kind of, one of the things that always seem to be vexing is, how do you add more material? I mean, if I take a piece of paper and I fold it, I can fold it down and fold it down and fold it down and fold it down. And I kind of figure that there are these kind of circumstances where one has to be able to unfold it to enlarge it. But at the same time, one thing that folding can't account for is growth. You can kind of artificially create the illusion of growth by unfolding, but the reality is tissues do gain in size. And I always thought that like unit formations could kind of like could be able to kind of solve this problem, but they really don't. They're not in the fact that the actual tissue expands. And the other thing is like one of the things that's interesting. I guess what you could do is you could kind of once you expanded it, you could kind of fractalize it, and then you'd be able to kind of like take account for the different patterns that would kind of like scale as you move through it. But again, I don't know of anyone who's doing that. But I mean, I think it's a very kind of difficult problem. But at least eventually, I think someone will figure that out if they haven't already. One of the things that was interesting is I remember kind of thinking about it, kind of like a self-similar mathematical reality, and I kind of said, "Well, would it be great?" And then I kind of found fractals, and I was like, "Oh, okay, we do have that." So maybe there are, the kind of there are those kind of things that are kind of happening in right now in terms of organic investigations, in terms of surfaces and things like that. But I think we're ways away. It's funny. I remember, in 1980 when I first kind of started thinking about this, I kind of felt as if like we were close. But now as time goes on, and I realize, 40 years hence, it's still an incredibly difficult thing, but I've learned some things along the way. And I think one of the things, like I said tonight, was the idea is kind of like applications of activities, not applications of habitations. And I think that's because we kind of like need to kind of start, as we said earlier on, we need to see architecture as a verb, not a noun. And I think that terms of two things, process and activity. Anyway, so back to you in terms of like your extensive notes, which are kind of giving me a lot of ideas here.
Great. Well, here's one you'll particularly covet. And this is the ability of one species to copy a microstructure or an organelle or an appendage of a completely different species, completely different. We're jumping into the kingdom of Animalia, and I go right back to the chameleon vine or Bocchia, which possesses something mind-blowing. It has eyes. It doesn't have human eyes. What it has are insect eyes. So it turns out the three hypotheses that have been proposed, meaning how does the Bocchia make these rapid copies of multiple species of plants without physically touching them? One could argue if one has to touch a plant, these copies could be achieved by a signal that's wholly chemical. That's what people thought. But when they were observed and filmed in slow motion, they never touched many of these plants. So the only explanation is and it's a beautiful explanation, is they are seeing these plants.
And possibly as a result have mirror neurons.
They might possibly.
Because I mean, here's the thing. Yeah. They're observing it among themselves because the thing is, in their own creation of this piece, it comes from another mechanism that has demonstrated this in case that they're kind of doing this similar copy.
Right? Yeah. So,
but they're doing it visually as the same way in which we do.
Yeah. I mean, yes, they do touch some plants, meaning if this vine, this chameleon vine, is growing up a tree, they are, of course, in close, intimate physical contact. But in many cases, it's copying other plants, other vines, even flowers that it is not physically touching. So here are the three hypotheses that have been proposed. And these are hypotheses. One is horizontal gene transfer, which I think is certainly a reasonable one. Now, HGT does and doesn't work here. It works because horizontal gene transfer is fairly rapid, can happen in a generation, but it's not quite as rapid as a chameleon vine operates. I mean, it can do these things within hours or days or weeks. Horizontal gene transfer is usually nowhere near that rapid, but
Right.
as you scale down, meaning you go from a macroorganism to a microorganism such as a bacteria, the speed increases dramatically, meaning it
Hmm.
can horizontal gene transfer
Hmm.
very, very quickly. I don't think quite this quickly, though.
No, I don't think so
I
either. Because I
mean,
think what has to happen is they have to be able to transcribe these as a series of things that can, like a cuttlefish,
yeah,
be easily and quickly deployed.
right.
So the idea is, I think that it's one thing to kind of like they couldn't possibly go out and take all the 10 things and
No,
instantly kind of like integrate them.
on a cellular
No,
level, it
exactly. I mean,
just
and this
doesn't
takes us
make
back
sense. Yeah.
to the piece we are talking about weeks ago about when we were talking about this century of genius in Whitehead's History of Science. We talked about the fact that at the same time as Bacon was this idea that induction had a premise in the kind of uh, uh, the articulation of artists like Leonardo, who basically were incredibly naturally kind of drawn to the way in which they kind of took their notes of things that existed. So that kind of like descriptive naturalistic art was actually a sense of getting to kind of apply the mechanisms, not just simply delineate the images. Which takes me to something that I thought was very important that we talked about, and I want to kind of talk about it briefly, which was a difference between copying, playing, and education. Um, One of the reasons I kind of, in terms of the artificial world, have a concern with copying is because it never kind of generates great art in itself, but has a value in the fact that it educates the artist and the fact that they have the capacity to do that. Now, we talked briefly last week about the fact that we see play. And, it's interesting that we say someone plays an instrument or someone plays judo. I always found, I was a miserable judo player, got to be a brown belt.
I think so.
It was terrible. I got to be a
Really? I
brown
don't know.
belt.
I
So,
think that's a little harsh.
okay. I mean, I just,
I thought you were pretty good.
like, okay, right. But
Or
again,
good.
I was a brown belt. Was a brown belt, and I
That's
kind
an
of felt that was
achievement.
an achievement, yeah.
Yeah.
But I kind of felt as if like one of the things that was important was kind of the ability to kind of adapt to the circumstance. But so we called it playing. Judo was something you played, and it kind of reminded me of when I would see bears or dogs, kind of rolling around and kind of getting a sense of the familiarity of the things that they would do that would become their activities. And I think one of the things that was funny, Sensei Weishi always said, like, Bruce, you think too much. And I think one of the things was I never allowed myself to kind of fall into that kind of naturalistic kind of like activity. And I think what's interesting is animals, I think it's easier for them, or it appears easier for them from my observation, to not become overly conscious and think too much about what they're doing and just simply feel it and have it become part of them. Because I think one of the things that I think holds us back is this idea that we feel as if we have to know before we can kind of do.
Mm-hmm.
And I kind of feel as if doing kind of comes. In fact, I had a brilliant student long time ago, and she was brilliant in the fact that she understood well before she could articulate it, which of course is kind of something that's very difficult for architectural professors to accommodate. And it was very difficult for her, but eventually she kind of got, I think, the accolades that she deserved. But the point is, I mean, what is it? Maybe the point is, what is it that we copy?
Mm-hmm.
Now, I think in listening to Julie in the last 2 weeks, what we found is in the natural world, there's a very clear indication of what's important, and the adaptation is necessarily for survival. Now, in the case of the copy, in the artificial sense, we have to substitute for something else. Just like I found that, like, people, when they talk about morality, they talk about the fact that religions and societies have created moralities, when in fact, animals have their own natural morality that comes up in the fact that they themselves also conduct what is good and what is bad in terms of the way in which they condition and kind of like police each other. So I don't believe that. I think, again, morality is, again, something like the metaphor and like the analog and like so many other things that we have not invented. We just simply understand that impulse in ourselves as part of our natural kind of, circumstance. So, with that saying, I think for me, we need to do in copying what nature has done in terms of what Julie has described really brilliantly in terms of the way in which these things can be used for adaptation. Now, maybe that means that the transcription process or the invention process, how we kind of understand that in terms of our own imagination.
I want to leave you enough time at the end.
Okay, go.
Okay, I'll just leave you with this, that this plant, the chameleon vine, actually has comparable sight to invertebrate wasp eyes. That was the
Really?
comparison, which is a very advanced eye. It's called a simple eye. It's called an ocelli, OCELLI.
Mhm.
And I will leave you with these very quick thoughts because Bruce needs time to finish up, of course, which is copying as satire, copying as tribute, or the perpetuation of an indelible original.
Mm.
Groucho Marx to Bugs Bunny, Jacques Tati to the Pink Panther, the Marx Brothers to Monty Python, compared to bald-faced plagiarism by copyists or plagiarists who didn't have anywhere near the talent or the skills of the original, such as Elmer Fudd to Jerry Lewis, Rafe Vaughan to Florence Price, Frederick Delius to Florence Price, Mendelssohn to.
Where?
Yeah.
Okay.
I'm leaving
Oh.
with some thoughts.
Oh,
On to you.
that's okay.
These are some new ideas that we can
okay.
discuss in the future.
Yeah, I like that. I like that. I mean,
Yeah, that's all.
some of them were a bit disturbing. And I think that, we're going to be talking about original work. We've hinted at it. And I mean,
these are
we're
ideas,
kind of like,
and
So
talk about them in the future.
yeah, agreed.
Just throwing them out there.
No, I like that.
Yeah.
So
I'm nothing
in
if
fact,
not shocking and surprising.
that's true. In fact, one of the things, and it's good because I'm looking at the titles now. Next week is the beauty of original ideas. So this fits perfectly into that. And I think the piece that's so compelling is, you talk about the fact that something is original, something is unique, but it is derived from a completely understood circumstance or well understood circumstance of something that went previously. So when you talk about Bugs Bunny and Groucho Marx, and you talk about the Marx Brothers and the Python group, you realize that there is that similarity, and the fact that these people had to have understood and appreciated the work that was done in order to be the other one, but they do themselves become an individual unto themselves. So when we'll talk next week about original ideas, it's not that we're going to talk about the thing as an idea is kind of like something that is completely unique and doesn't have derivative aspects. And I don't mean by derivative, I don't mean it still looks like they were doing it. I mean, you can see the embodiment of Groucho Marx in a lot of pieces of Bugs Bunny, but at the same time, it's a different characterization in its principle. So I think in that case, that's what allows these things to be so significant. The Marx Brothers and the Pythons are so brilliant and they kind of follow each other, but the context and the circumstance are very highly different, which allows for the different manifestations and the different kind of surrealistic. I mean, they both share that surrealistic aspect, but it's done in a completely different way. I love the Marx Brothers. They are the greatest comedians that ever lived. The Pythons, in my case, are second. But again, at that point, you're kind of splitting hairs. So we're off to having a really great
right.
show next week, which is the 18th of January, The Beauty of Original Ideas. And then on our anniversary, we're going to call what we have the anniversary issue. And that's in the realm of ideas. It's not the anniversary of the realm of ideas. It's our 31st anniversary. So the realm of ideas is free to all, and it's to the benefit of all for us to keep it exactly that way.
Indubitably.